How can I be confident in a crisis? The Bible teaches us that there are three kinds of storms in life: storms that we bring on ourselves, like Samson and his self-induced troubles; storms that God causes, like the one that Jesus stilled on Lake Galilee; and storms that other people cause, as when Paul and Silas were thrown into prison. When you are the innocent party in a crisis, that last kind of storm is especially hard to take. So how do we deal with these crises? How do we stay calm and maintain our confidence and courage regardless of what happens? In Acts 27, 9 through 12, God put the Apostle Paul as a prisoner on board a ship headed from Palestine to Rome. Actually, Paul had a great desire to go to Rome and preach, but he hadn't planned on this being the means of getting there. After the ship ventured through the Mediterranean Sea and docked at the island of Crete, God told Paul to advise the crew not to leave the harbor because there was going to be a great storm. But the sailors were impatient to get to a better harbor, so they ignored what God had told them through Paul. Impatience often gets us into trouble. When we allow ourselves to become impatient, we find ourselves faced with a storm. I have spoken with many crisis-ridden people who were impatient. Impatient to get married, impatient to get a new job, or impatient to move to the other side of town. They didn't take time to check things out with God, and they sailed right off into the waiting storms. Paul told the sailors in verse 10, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also." But they sailed into the storm anyway. Why? Because they were following human nature. There are three common reasons why people get themselves in a mess, and these reasons hold true whether the mess happened about 2,000 years ago in the book of Acts or happens today, because human nature has not changed. Wrong guidance from the experts. The centurion who had charge over Paul ignored his plea and instead followed the advice given by both the pilot and the owner of the ship. They left the harbor. This points up the first reason we get ourselves into a mess. We listen to the wrong experts. The world is full of people with crazy ideas, and it seems as if every week someone is proposing a new therapy or a new cult. One person will say, the key to life is to eat bananas and yogurt. Someone else will say, no, the key to life is to put yourself in some strange position and go, Om. The third person will say, no, the key to life is to buy our seminar tapes. It seems that everybody has a way. Everybody has an expert opinion. But the fact is that experts are often wrong. Some people go around asking experts what they think until they find a person who agrees with them, just to substantiate their own biases. When you start asking the wrong experts, you're going to get yourself into a mess or a storm. The only truly reliable expert is God. Wrong guidance from a vote. We learn in verse 12 that because the harbor where they were docked was unsuitable in winter, the majority of the crew decided that the ship should sail on. They hoped to reach Phoenix and its safe harbor on the other side of Crete. The second reason we get ourselves into trouble is that we take a vote. The fact is that the majority can be wrong. Do you remember what happened when Moses first started to lead the children of Israel toward the Promised Land? The majority wanted to return to Egypt, but they were wrong. We can get ourselves into a real mess by following the prevailing opinion, the most popular ideas. If we listen to God, we will go in the right direction. Wrong guidance from circumstances. In verse 13, the story continues, when a gentle south wind began to blow, they, the ship's crew, thought they had obtained what they wanted, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. It proved to be a bad decision. Why else do we get ourselves into trouble? Because we rely on circumstances. Notice that the Bible says there was a gentle south wind. What could be better for a nice, gentle Mediterranean cruise? The sailors thought they had gotten their wishes because the circumstances looked favorable. But it is foolish and unwise to ignore what God says, even if circumstances tend to contradict it. Things might look good right now, but you may be sailing right into a storm. I've heard people say, Well, this decision must be okay because I feel so good about it. A popular song from the 1970s says, "It can't be wrong when it feels so right." The fact is that feelings often lie. If God says, "Wait in the harbor," you'd better wait in the harbor because the devil can arrange undesirable circumstances if you put out to sea. As I talk with people in counseling, I hear over and over again that they thought they had obtained what they wanted, but then went sailing right into a storm, just as the sailors in the book of Acts did. In verse 14, they found themselves caught in a wind of hurricane force called a northeaster. The ship, like so many couples I counsel, became caught in the storm and could not head into the wind. Don't drift. When we're caught in a crisis, we typically react in 3 ways, the same 3 ways the sailors did. Their reactions were typical of people under pressure. In verse 15, because the sailors couldn't head into the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Later, in verse 17, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. The first thing that storms tend to do is cause us to drift. We let go of our goals. We forget where we're headed. We forget our values and start drifting. Because they were not equipped with compasses and the stars were completely obscured by the storm, the sailors were in total darkness. When you are in a dark situation in which you can't see the stars and don't have a compass, what do? You drift. The waves beat you back and forth, and you are led wherever they take you. Your problems batter you back and forth. These strong currents in your life can make you feel like asking, "What's the use? Why fight it?" And we just go with the flow. Don't discard. Things didn't get any better on the Apostle Paul's voyage to Rome. Verses 18 through 19. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the 3rd day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When a crisis emerges for us, first we start drifting, and then we start discarding things from our lives. With the sailors, in verse 38, it was first the cargo, then the ship's tackle, eventually their food. And finally, in verses 43 and 44, themselves. They all jumped overboard and started swimming to shore. Often when we find ourselves in a crisis of life, we are tempted to throw out the very things that are important to us, the values that we have hung on to in better times. We have a tendency to throw things out because we're under pressure and want to get rid of it all. We become impulsive. We give up on our dreams. We run out on relationships. We throw away values that we learned as children. Don't despair. The third thing that the sailors did was to give up hope. In verse 20 we learn, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. In an extreme crisis, we eventually get to the point of despair and give up all hope. The last thing we throw out when we have a problem is hope. And when we've thrown that away, we have had it. The sailors spent 14 days in total darkness in a little ship in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. They were bashed back and forth by the storm until they threw out everything and gave up all hope. Perhaps you feel like that right now. Have you been going through a problem the past week or past month or past year that has been batting you back and forth? Have you come to the point where you've thrown things out and now you've come to the point of despair? Remember the sailors. They gave up hope because they had forgotten that God is in control. They forgot that God had a plan. They forgot that God can inject hope into an absolutely hopeless situation. The amazing thing of this story is Paul's reaction. It is a 180-degree turnaround from the way the sailors responded to this crisis. The sailors were in despair. They said the situation was hopeless. They were discouraged and depressed and tossed everything overboard to try to keep the ship afloat. But Paul provides a different model for us. He was calm and confident. He had courage in the crisis. Absolutely nothing fazed him. The sailors' reactions were the natural responses that we tend to have in a crisis, but they do not have to be our reactions. One test of our Christianity is how we handle a crisis. It is easier to live like a Christian when things are going great, when all our prayers are being answered, when we're in good health, when our income is rising. It is easy to be a Christian at times like that. The test of our faith is when the problems come and we are tempted to despair, to drift, and to throw out the things that are really important in life. Character is revealed in a crisis, not made in a crisis. Character is made in the day-by-day, mundane, trivial things of life, the routine. Character is developed there, but it is revealed when we get into a shipwreck, into a situation that threatens to swallow us up. What should we do when things look as if they're falling apart and the ship is going to crash and disintegrate? What should we do when we're battered by big problems? Look at what the sailors did in verse 29. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. The safest thing to do when we get in a storm is to drop our anchors. Just stand still. Situations change and the sands of time shift. Psalm 125:1 in the Bible says that those who put their trust in God are immovable like Mount Zion. Often, when people encounter a major problem, they want to change everything else in their lives at the same time because the situation feels overwhelming and they can't stand still. A person will lose his or her spouse by death or divorce, and the typical reaction is, I'm going to quit my job, I'm going to sell everything, and move to a whole new location and start over. But that is exactly what they do not need, more change. What they need to do is put down some anchors and get some stability. Why was Paul so confident? Because he was encouraged by 3 tremendous truths, 3 foundational beliefs of the Christian life that serve as anchors of the soul. These 3 truths can anchor you on the rock of stability, so that when the winds of crisis blow you back and forth, you will have confidence. These are truths that you can build your life on, that will stabilize you in the storm. God's presence. The first anchor in a crisis is the presence of God. Acts 27:3 reveals what Paul said in the midst of the storm. Last night an angel of the God whose I am, and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, Do not be afraid, Paul. From this we learn that storms can never hide God from us. We may not see him, but he sees us. We may think God is a million miles away, but he is with us and is watching us. God sent a personal representative, an angel, to tell Paul, I am with you. I see you in the stormy Mediterranean Sea in that little ship. God promises in Hebrews 13:5, Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. In Matthew 28:20, Surely I will be with you always. And in John 14:16, I will ask the Father, and he will give you another comforter. Over and over the Bible says that wherever we are, God is right there with us. We never go through anything by ourselves because God is always with us. No matter what situation you are going through right now, God is with you. He is the anchor that you can fully trust. God's purpose. The second anchor in a crisis is found in Acts 27:24, where Paul quotes God's angel. Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. God told Paul, I have a plan for your life. You are on board this ship because I have a purpose for your being on this ship. I have a purpose for your life that is greater than the temporary storm you are in. The second anchor in a crisis is God's purpose. Every Christian ought to have a sense of destiny. No person is born by accident, regardless of the circumstances of one's birth. You are not here on earth just to take up space. God has a specific purpose and plan for your life. Storms are simply temporary setbacks toward fulfilling that purpose. Absolutely nothing can change God's ultimate purpose for your life unless you choose to disobey him. If you choose to reject his plan, He will allow you to do that. But the Scriptures teach that no outside person can change God's plan for your life. God leaves that up to you. You can either accept it or you can reject it. No matter what happens on the outside, however, external forces cannot alter God's purpose for your life as long as you say, God, I want to do your will. God's purpose is greater than any situation you will ever experience. God has a plan beyond the problems you are facing right now. The point is this: it is dangerous to focus on your problems more than your purpose for living. If you do that, you'll start drifting and discarding. You will start despairing if you keep your eyes on the problem rather than on God's purpose for your life. Once you lose your goal, you will lose sight of the very meaning for which you exist, and you will become purposeless. God's promise. The third anchor that gives us confidence in a crisis is found in verse 25, where Paul says, "Keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me." The third anchor is God's promise. God keeps his promises without fail. Storms cannot hide our faces from God because God is always with us. Storms cannot change the purpose of God because it is ultimate. Storms cannot destroy the child of God because God's promise is sure. Some of us are going through devastating crises right now. Our problems are overwhelming, and we think we're going under for the last time. God says this to you: you may lose the cargo, you may lose the tackle of the ship, you may lose the ship, you may even get wet, but you are going to make it because of the promise of God. As the old saying goes, God said it, I believe it, and that settles it. So what do? Relax. Be confident in your crisis. What should we do while waiting for the crisis to end? The same thing the sailors did. Acts 27:29 says that was, fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. Anchor yourself on the truths of God and pray for daylight. What was the result aboard the ship? Morning came. Verses 39 through 44 reveal that when daylight came, the sailors didn't recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground. All 276 people jumped overboard and got safely to land. In the storms of your life, God says, I am with you. Let his truth stabilize your life and give you the confidence you need in every crisis you face. Storms cannot hide God from you or you from God. You may be going through some difficult times right now, but God has a purpose for your life. There is a reason for it all, and you are going to make it safely to land.